thank you for everyone coming along today. In the chat just before today's session, we were kind of saying that the budget, in some respects, was a little bit underwhelming. There wasn't an awful lot that was very, very specific to local government, not a lot of big announcements that came through. But I think the issue for me, as much as anything, is looking at those public finance numbers, looking at the forecasts and the projections and the assumptions, and working out what that means for local government. Because in the end, even though there's nothing very specific in there, it's got really big consequences for what's going on in our sector. And of course, there were some other big things that happened as well that I think will make a big difference around Devo and enterprise zones and that kind of thing. But actually, I think changes the relationship between the centre and local government. So in terms of the budget and the overview, I think one of the key things for me is that the public finances do look really weak. They still look very weak, even though they have improved compared to what we had back in November 22, back in the autumn statement. So things have improved, but not by much. The borrowing was slightly lower, £22 billion lower than expected in January. This last month gone, so they were the last figures that the OBR put out before the budget itself. But within that, there's no room for major spending increases and no room for permanent tax cuts. We've got some tax cuts that actually were announced yesterday, but quite importantly, that they're not permanent, they're temporary. And despite all that, all those changes, announcements, the headroom the Chancellor's got is still only 6.5 billion, 0.2% of GDP, which effectively is a margin of error. So that leaves the public finances very exposed to risk, very exposed to downturn, very exposed to things not quite turning out as the Chancellor or the OBR expects. So there were some spending increases. Defence increasing to 2.5% of GDP. A biggish announcement on childcare as well, and extension of energy support. And those tax cuts, mostly temporary, as I said, around pension thresholds, fuel duty, and the capital allowances as well. So some biggish ones there, but mostly not permanent. And a key takeaway, I think, is that the Chancellor chose to give away the surplus that was generated rather than bank those for the future. So it's in that sense, he's taken a bit of a risk with the public finances. Future growth is weak, and this is really the key thing, I think, for us as much as anything. If growth is low, then that means that funding increases will be low as well. So we're looking at sort of 1% real terms growth, which doesn't, in public spending overall, which doesn't leave all that much for unprotected services. And some of the analysis today from the IFS actually is more pessimistic than that. So it's worth thinking through those things. As I said, there's not much in it financially for local government. £200 million potholes fund, £60 million swimming pool fund, and a whole host of different levelling up funds. But I think it's around the Trailblazer devolution offer that's really very significant, and around the abolition of LEPs, the creation of these new investment zones. It just kind of leads to a much bigger economic development role and leadership role for local government, and certainly for the mayoral combined authorities and mayoral combined county authorities as well. So some big changes there on the horizon. And some of that might spill over into the general way that the local government funding system is operated. I was just thinking about these questions as we go through all the analysis today. The first couple, really, what do the forecasts for public finances mean for local government funding? Are there any indicators there that we can take for what the parameters might be for the spending review in 2024? Are there any specific funding announcements for local government? We know there aren't many, but it's worth keeping an eye out for them. And are there any indications for the future of local government funding reform, especially around business rates reform, fair funding review, that kind of thing? And then are there potentially any new powers or burdens for local government? Not very much, but again, just keeping an eye out for those things. So getting into the budget itself, and most of these charts you'll have seen yesterday in the briefing note that we sent out, but they form the basis of most of our analysis to start off with today. First point to make is that we have not gone into recession. Technically, we have avoided a recession by the absolute narrowest of margins. We need 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. We managed to have a flat quarter, the last quarter just gone, so that means we just missed it. But that does mean that growth is very weak. In the current financial year coming up, for what's current calendar year, the OBR is forecasting negative growth of 0.2%, so essentially flat. So it's not assuming that there'll be any growth this year, but the OBR has been a little bit on the negative, pessimistic side recently. And then that growth rises to 1.8% in 24, and then it kind of goes up to about 2 percentage points of growth every year after that. But that's a long time in the future. Now we don't quite know where that will be, and actually that's relatively high growth compared to the trend rates that we've had in recent years. And that really was where the Chancellor was trying to get to in his budget yesterday. It was a budget for growth. I guess if you looked at that and looked at what had happened to future growth rates in the budget compared to what they were in the autumn statement, they're slightly down on where they were 4 months ago. So I'm not sure that's a huge vote of confidence. But basically underpinning all the public finance numbers in the next few years is going to be how much growth can the economy deliver. And another key headline, I think, for us is going to be around consumer price index inflation. So CPI peaked in December 2022, just gone, at 10.5%. And then with the energy bills increases dropping out and the energy prices dropping as well, everyone is expecting inflation to drop quite quickly over the next 12 to 24 months. The OBR forecast that was announced yesterday is that CPI will be 2.9% by the end of the year. I think a lot of people think that's possibly a bit pessimistic. That's a big drop, 8 percentage points nearly over a 12-month period. And after that, much lower levels of inflation and possibly tipping over into a negative inflation as well, which does have implications for the way that we're funded. Now that core local government funding is formally linked to the increases in CPI, so SFA uplifts and any cap compensation are all now linked to CPI. So forecasting that is really important. If CPI increases by 6.3%, which is the level of as you'll see from the Bank of England next year, that's worth about a £1 billion increase in SFA. But if it increases by only 2.9%, as the OBR forecast, then that's only 460 million. So it's quite a big difference in the level of funding based on the amount of CPI inflation that we've got in September 23. Everyone believes that CPI is going to fall quite rapidly next year, but the pace of that decline is really important for us in the way that we forecast what's going to happen next year. This chart looks at the Bank of England's forecast from the February MPC report from last month, and you can see here the range of outcomes or forecasts for CPI over the next couple of years, and just how uncertain that decline in CPI is going to be. And you can see there, that's the 2.9% forecast from the OBR. That's right at the bottom end of that range of forecasts that we had from the Bank of England. So you can see that it was a bit of an outlier in terms of how much CPI inflation is going to fall over the next 12 months or 9 months or so. And then if we look at that forecast for CPI over the next couple of years and compare that with the GDP deflator, which is essentially the government's estimate of how much inflation is within the local government, within the public sector, you can see there that at the current time, within the last year or so, the GDP deflator, i.e. public sector inflation, has been quite a lot lower than the consumer price index. So that's the level of, I guess you could say it's a bit of a margin between the amount of funding that we've received by picking things to CPI compared to how much actual inflation has been. But then you can see from the end of this calendar year, from Q4 2023, you can see from that point onwards that CPI and the deflator are more or less converged as they would normally be. I guess, Locum, you would argue that the uplifts in SFA should fund both unit cost increases from inflation and demand-led pressures. But there we go. That's probably a bit more generous than we would normally see from government funding. Then looking at the fiscal rules, this is a really important factor about what's gone on with yesterday's budget. The fiscal rule that the Chancellor has, and he adopted it back in November last year, is that debt must be falling as a percentage of GDP by year 5 of the fiscal plan. So that's 27-28. He's only just achieved that. He has a headroom of only 6.5 billion, which is almost within the margin of error. But what this means is that the strategy in the budget has been all about getting year 5 right. Hence, a lot of the tax cuts have been short term. They actually stop in 26, 27. In some ways, you could say that that's the tail wagging the dog. It's the fiscal rule determining what all the tax cuts and benefits are that are going to come through. So, it's not a great way to make policy. Then there's a supplementary target that public sector borrowing must be under 3% of GDP. But I think one point that's worth making is that the UK's debt is lower than most of the developed countries. Another point to make is that higher debt does lead to higher interest payments. So whilst there's no necessarily the right level of debt, the more debt you've got, the more interest payments you can be making, and the bigger risk that you've got on the budget in the future. Worth mentioning as well that the Chancellor has within the budget historically high levels of taxation. So you can see here receipts at around sort of 40-41%. That's just it's higher than it's been for a long time. And you can see, I think, kind of quite an inflection point around the pandemic and with the cost of living crisis afterwards. So even with expenditure as well, the new normal is now up from short of 40% before the pandemic in 2019-20, up to nearly 42% of GDP by 2027-28. So a big uplift in both taxation and in spending. Although, to be honest, that wasn't something that came out of this budget. That was something that happened back in the autumn statement. For tax plans, tax proposals and what's happening with national taxation, you can see here some really big increases in the amount of tax income that the Chancellor's got coming through. Partly that's to do with inflation. Some changes to the way in tax policy, and again, most of the first two of these certainly are short term. So the big increase in corporation tax from 19% to 25%, but that's partially offset now by these new capital allowances, so allowing businesses to fully expense their capital investment on plant, machinery and IT for 3 years. So that's a fairly chunky amount of expenditure or lost taxation over the next 3 years, 26 billion over 3 years. But one point that the IFS made this morning at their presentation was that corporation tax revenue as a percentage of GDP will actually reach record highs in future years, because it's all about a combination of corporation tax rates as well as the amount of capital allowances and what you can charge to corporation tax. So reach about 3.7% of GDP, which is pretty much the highest that they've ever been. Fuel duty, we all knew that the 5% increase in the linking with RPI would be reversed. It's effectively been permanently cut, but within the numbers in 2027-28, it's assumed that that fuel duty starts to increase again. We all know it's not. And then a lot of the news has been around the pension thresholds, the annual limit on pension contributions increasing from 40 to 60,000, and that lifetime threshold being removed entirely. In some respects, a relatively small amount of cost to the Treasury, but in terms of equity and fairness, that's the thing that's got the most traction within the media. I like this chart. In some ways, for me, it kind of pulls everything together about what's going on with the public finances. It shows you the public sector net borrowing or the debt or the planned deficit over the medium term. There has been an improvement in the forecast deficit for 25-26 onwards. Things doing a little bit better for various reasons, as we've seen in terms of like improved, smaller amounts of borrowing every month. As we know, the January borrowing figures were £22 billion better than forecast, although that's still worse than it was 12 months ago. But I think it also shows you that there's substantial risks in these forecasts, and I think some quite big concern about whether the Chancellor can actually meet those targets. I think it's true to say as well that Chancellors have typically had larger amounts of headroom, usually around 30 billion rather than the very, very minimal 6.5 billion. And also I think it's worth saying as well that the planned deficits in future years are starting to look a little bit more like the kinds of deficits that previous chancellors have gone for. So deficits of kind of 30 to 50 billion pounds are kind of a bit more normal. It's still towards the top end of that range, but those forecast deficits in 27-28 are starting to look a little bit more like budgets that we've had in the past. Total managed expenditure. So this is kind of the DELS and the AME spend within public finances. Again, a big step change in expenditure. And a big cash terms increase over the decade from 17-18 to 27-28 of 69%, so a 70% increase in cash terms in spending over that period, over a decade. So a really big uplift. Increases of NHS, social care, but also those big uplifts for index-linked pensions and benefits and interest payments as well. In terms of policy, which I think is really important for us, is that a lot of the fiscal tightening that was introduced back in the autumn statement is towards the back end of this period after the next general election, and there's been no change to that and to that profile and that policy in yesterday's budget. And I think it's pretty reasonable to say that the Chancellor is probably hoping that economic performance will get him off the hook if he's still Chancellor after the election, and that actually those cuts in services don't have to be made in the scale that are anticipated in those budget numbers. This is a chart from the Resolution Foundation's report that came out today or yesterday, I think it was. What it's saying is there's been no significant changes in spending plans compared to the autumn statement, so pretty much as it was with spending and with the DELS. What we know is that there's 1% real terms growth in spending in the next spending review period, and as you can see here, that compares to 3.2% real terms annualized growth in the current spending review period. So you can see in that chart, quite big. We've had quite big increases in spending, planned spending within the spending review during the spending review period, and that's really going to switch off from 25-26 onwards. I think the Resolution Foundation, along with the IFS as well, are actually quite sceptical about whether those levels of spending restraint will actually be achievable or will actually go through. But for those of us, in local government who are within that unprotected section, we do have to be aware that the planned spending restraint is really quite considerable over the medium term. Another good chart from the Resolution Foundation was about public sector net investment, which you don't often look at actually, but it's worth just noting that effectively capital spending is at relatively high levels compared to the recent past. Supposed to average at 2.5% of GDP over the next 5 years. And the Resolution Foundation says this is the highest sustained level of capital spending since the late 1970s. So in that respect, that's a good thing. But there were some big cuts that have been made in capital spending that were made back in the autumn, and they haven't been reversed in yesterday's budget. So capital spending will reduce to about 2.1% of GDP by 27-28. But that's still much higher than we were used to for much of the last 30 years. The report's actually really good looking to have a look at, actually, the Resolution Foundation. It's got a great title as well. It's called We're Going on a Growth Hunt, which is, I guess, a pun around what Jeremy Hunt was trying to achieve in the budget, which is all about trying to achieve growth. Then looking at some of these spending plans, so the top of that list really is about defence. That was pre-announced, the decision to go to 2.5% of GDP from the current 2.1%. That's worth 2 billion extra in 23-24 and then 3 billion extra in 24-25. So some big chunky increases there. It's not confirmed for the next spending review period as yet because the Chancellor can't afford it, but that's the intention, is to make that stick. A big announcement around childcare for working age parents, 33 hours for children from 9 months until they start school, and an increase in the government funded rate for all 3 hours. So some quite big increases, ramping up to 5 billion by 2027-28. The council, the issue there will be about whether you have, because you have responsibility for ensuring that sufficiency of local provision, and whether the money is there to make that happen and make sure that there are the providers there, the workforce is there, that it can all be afforded. Sam Friedman, a good commentator that is worth reading, used to be a SPAD in DFE, calls it by far the biggest increase in childcare ever, up to 5 billion by 27-28. But he's got concerns about whether the hourly rate is sufficient, something that's a bit outside our kind of like experience, expertise area, but clearly that's quite a big issue. The energy price guarantee extended at 2,500 until the 30th of June, and then increases to £3,000 per year from the 1st of July. But this is interesting that the IFS pointing out that there are £25 billion worth of commitments that the government's effectively saying that it will implement when the fiscal situation allows. So that's things like continuing that defence commitment of 2.5%, increasing the overseas aid budget to 0.7% of GDP, continuing the full expensing of capital allowances. All of these have not been continued beyond into year 5 because the Chancellor can't afford it if he's going to achieve his fiscal rule. But they're all things that could end up flowing through into the budget in the spending review next time round. And then Stop Press, just before we started the webinar, there was news that the NHS and DHSC had agreed a 5.2% consolidated pay award, which is higher than the 3.5% funding that's in the DEL. So there's a question there about how it's funded. I assume, or you read other people saying they're assuming that HMT will use the reserve in the short term, but will the NHS be asked to absorb that higher pay award, or will it be given more funding from general resources in future years to fund it? If it's the latter, then that's less money that's available for local government and other unprotected services. Putting all that together, this chart was from this morning's IFS presentation, and it's a bit of a bleaker picture actually than we've been working on to date. So there's still, on the left-hand side of that chart, you can see there's still the 1% real terms growth in overall public spending. But on the far right-hand side, you can see there that the IFS is now saying that potentially unprotected budgets could be looking at a 3.2% real terms cut in funding. We were thinking it could be 0.7% real terms cut, but they're saying 3.2%. And the reason for that is that that deterioration in that longer term picture is that there are some quite big chunky increases in funding that are kind of semi-committed to but not yet funded. And if the government or a future government does decide to fund those in the future spending review, that leaves a lot less for unprotected services like local government. So that's a big decision that we're looking out for in the next spending round. Another issue that was also brought out by the IFS, which is really interesting, is that there's been a big reduction in defence spending over the last 70 years, and you could argue, or you could kind of correlation there with, and say that the reduction in defence spending has allowed health spending to increase relatively quickly, or rather, one has funded the other. You could argue it's not entirely like for like, because there's been population growth which has kind of fed into health spending, and it's funded other services too. But we've never had a situation where there's been big increases in both the NHS and defence spending. So that will, in some ways, potentially crowd out spending on unprotected services, including local government. So that does present quite a crunch in the figures over the next 5 years and beyond that, for that matter. So looking ahead to that spending review, which we'd imagine would be in autumn 2024, and probably will be after the next general election, which we'd imagine would be in the spring. So what does that look like? So, to be honest, I've not quite updated some of these points that were made here for some of the stuff that was in the IFS's presentation this morning. But we're still working on the basis that unprotected services will fall by real terms 0.7%. But as we said, the settlements could be tighter than expected, and it could get worse. On the other hand, the IFS and Resolution Foundation, they don't think that those really tight settlements are really going to stick. They even thought 0.7% real terms cut was a bit too tight. So we wait to see. But depending on what inflation is, what does that mean for cash terms increases? If inflation is 1 to 2%, that could mean that the cash terms increase in the funding for unprotected services next time round is between 0.3 and 1.3%. Potentially, we're guessing a little bit there, but it kind of gives you an idea of the ballpark, the broad level of increase that we might be expecting. I think outside of that, I would still be expecting to see social care funding increasing more quickly than that. In our modelling, we're assuming at least a £500 million additional increase in grant funding for social care. That's the lowest level that social care has had in terms of grant funding increases over the last 7 or 8 years. I think that's kind of the lowest it could go to. And we're also not expecting any return of the social care charging reforms in the near future. And if they are, new money would have to be found for those. I don't want to spend much time on this. It was just something that we looked at a meeting with London councils last Friday. It's just showing that some of the resources for social care have been increasing quickly and potentially increasing more quickly than spending on adult social care. But a point was made to me that the increase in social care resources includes both children's and adults. So if anyone's got any comments about how much of their social care grant they allocate to children, so I'd be very interested to know what that is, because there is a danger that the HMT see how much spending has been going up relative to funding and start to put the brakes on social care funding, because I think they've given us too much. Finally, the public health grant has been announced. Really light. It's always light, and I don't really understand why it takes that long to get these allocations out. So we've got firm allocations for 23-24, indicative allocations for 24-25. They've gone up in line with the GDP deflator, so 3.2% next year, 1.3% the year after. So that meets the commitment that was in the spending review that public health funding would be protected in real terms. There's a small grant that's been rolled in as well, 1.4 million, and no change in the distribution of grants. Another point that I thought was interesting that Tony Travers was making earlier today was about how the increase in funding for the NHS for health and social care has increased by 43%, by a much higher level than the funding for public health, only 13%. Now, I don't know whether public health funding would have gone up by 43% had it been part of the NHS still. That's a moot point, we don't know, but it does just show you how much more the funding for the NHS has increased relative to funding for a service that's controlled by local government, public health. Now moving on to look at these Trailblazer devolution bids and all the other sort of, I think, quite important announcements that have come out yesterday around this stuff. So the two Trailblazer devolution pilots, I guess, are in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, the kind of the two Devo areas that are the furthest on, most developed, and I guess the most mature as well in that sense. But the idea is that these two Trailblazers are a blueprint for deeper devolution across the rest of England. A range of really interesting things that they'll be taking on board around transport, around skills, around housing. I think for us, the things that are probably the most important are that long-term commitment to retaining 100% of business rates. Of course, both Greater Manchester and West Midlands are two of the Devo areas that have already got 100% business rate pilots and have had them since 2017-18. But the idea is they'll be kind of deepened and I guess will go on for longer. And then this idea about having multi-year funding settlements at the next spending review, so all the funding streams that they get would go through a single budget with flexibility about how to spend that budget. And those settlements will cover things like local growth and place, local transport, housing regeneration, adult skills, retrofitting buildings, etc. So a really big, potentially really big package of devolution responsibilities and funding going on there. For local government generally, I think it has got wider implications, even if you're outside one of these Devo Trailblazers. So I think it starts to set the agenda again for going back to that idea of 100% retention and potentially having longer resets. Effectively, as I said, it kind of extends the pilots that they've got already in these Devo areas. I don't know what that means for things like the levies and no detriment. In a letter today to local authorities, Lee Rowley, the local government minister, has said that the Devo areas would have 10-year retention of business rates, which is the one thing that is quite different from the current pilots. It's effectively saying you have a 10-year period where the business rate baseline won't be reset. Of course, we've effectively had that by default in local government anyway, because the baseline that we've got was set in 2013-14, and it's still not been reset. But I think there is that potential extension to the wider local government, although as Lee Rowley says, that is still some way off. Then also this idea about single multi-year funding assessments with more flexibility and independence, and also accompanied by a single outcomes-based accountability framework. So kind of they're talking about sort of like a departmental style settlement. So it's still got Westminster speak kind of around it, but obviously much more freedom and flexibility. I think in terms of distribution, it's got implications as well. So I think what we get is potentially carve-outs for these DEVO areas from national funding formulas. That's certainly technically possible, and really that already happens with the highway settlements. But I think for the rest of us in local government, it will potentially make distribution inconsistent and slightly more complicated. I think it's a question about whether local government generally wants it, but I think if we want more devolution, that means having things that are not as consistent across the country. More scrutiny coming in, I think, with these quarterly committees of local MPs, that almost like a slightly hybrid version of what scrutiny should look like. But then there's a really clear pathway then to roll out these new responsibilities, these new powers and flexibilities to the other MCAs and MCCAs, and then potentially more countrywide as well. So there's quite a pathway there for mayoral areas. Then government said it's minded to transfer the functions of LEPs to local government from April 24, so before the general election, and to consult on what that would be by the summer, about how that would work. I guess some issues for local government are things like, how do you interact with enterprise zones and the sharing of those business rate gains that you've got with the LEPs at the moment? How do the boundaries for those 38 LEPs fit in with the current MCA and DEVO and local authority boundaries? And I think the LGA's point is that this responsibility needs to match with the funding that local authorities and MCAs need to be able to deal with this stuff. But I think if nothing else, it's a big vote of confidence in local government. Then there are these 12 new investment zones, each zone potentially having funding for their interventions of up to £80 million over 5 years. I'm not quite sure whether is that a lot of money or not a lot of money. In some ways, it's a reasonable amount in some respects, but in terms of what's trying to be achieved, it doesn't seem huge. But quite a lot of funding streams and interventions and benefits that will be available in these zones, similar to those in Freeport. So it's quite a big benefit to those areas that are going to get them. And it's all about working collaboratively, led by the MCAs, but working with local universities, councils, businesses, etc. The zones that have been selected are quite interesting. As you can see here, they're all MCA areas. They're mostly very urban areas, really. The one MCA I think that's not been included there is the West of England MCA. I'm not sure why that would be. And I know I've seen some MP responses that are a little bit upset that their areas haven't been selected. No urban, no sort of more rural areas or more remote areas. They're quite kind of like metropolitan area focused. Then there is some specific additional funding for local government. So this is new potholes fund, £200 million. Chancellor said yesterday that was the result of particularly strong representations from some MPs, and I think the County Councils Network did a lot of lobbying on that in the run up to the budget, and congratulations to them for getting that additional funding for local government. £60 million for the swimming pool support fund. We don't know how that's going to be distributed. The LGA saying that they'd like to work with Sport England and the government about distributing that. They don't really want too many kind of like bidding pots to go ahead for that. I don't know how, so we don't know how that's going to work. But again, it's not a huge amount of money. And then a whole range of different levelling up funding pots, partnerships, funds, projects of all different types. Just try to summarise what those specific pots are. I'll leave you to go and explore those separately. Then there's this PWB, discounted rate for PWB loans for borrowing and housing revenue account for social delivery, which I think has been welcomed by most people. And then finally, just looking at local government funding reform. So we've got a general election that could be no later than January 25, but it's more likely to be May, June next year, trying to take advantage of the good weather. I guess the fallback is autumn 24 if things are going badly, but the spring looks like the most likely date. It's pretty sure now that, well, we know now that nothing's going to happen in terms of funding reform before the general election. So anything we're talking about really is going to be undertaken by a new government, whether it's Conservative or Labour-led. So things will change. I think the one thing that looks like it will still happen before the general election are all those proposals around Devo, the Trailblazers, investment zones, and LEPs. That agenda does seem like that could happen before the general election. But the other things that we're looking at as local authorities are really going to happen after the general election. So it's pretty clear as well, there's not going to be enough time for a new government to get anything ready in time for the December 24 provisional settlement. So in reality, we're looking at 2026, 27 at the earliest for any of those reforms to be implemented. So things like fair funding review and baseline reset, etc. Within the budget, ministers talking about bringing forward wider proposals to improve the local government finance landscape in the next parliament. Pretty general stuff. It's the sort of thing you'd expect them to say, but at least it's being said. And again, I assume that is the fair funding review, baseline reset as well. But I think slightly different options potentially if we are moving towards 100% retention in some of the Devo areas, about whether that does inform, other changes and other reforms around the business rate retention scheme as well. That comment about the government intending to expand the local retention of business rates to more areas in the next parliament. Again, I think that probably suggests some kind of extension of the Devo type 100% business rate pilots, but maybe not initially, but maybe something further down the line. So that's me finished on the budget. I'll hand over to Dan now to talk through local authority financial health and section 114s.
Thanks, Adrian. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
I think you might have to click the slides, Adrian. Thanks everybody. I'd like to speak today about section 114. Section 114 in the news, effectively. So I did a bit of a search of the Google to see what's been in there recently, and that's always pretty reliable at coming up with the latest stories. So you've got Slough, Croydon and Thurrock, which has been there for a long time, you'll all know about. But more recently, those Southampton, Woking, Runnymede, Ruttlesford, Warrington have been mentioned as well. In the news. So we'll look at those and look specifically at what we might learn from those. And for me, it gets back, as all things do, to balance sheet health. And how routinely do we check our balance sheet? What can we learn from the balance sheet of those authorities that have either issued a 114 or the news would have you think that they're close to doing so? And it's more than just reserves levels, particularly in the latest ones. There's a lot around capital health there. So what can we learn? And actually specifically, it's sort of a bit of a dig, I suppose, at the external auditors. Can we be wise before the fact? When I heard Grant Thornton with its report on learning from public interest reports, where a really good report, but actually lots of this has come out subsequently to the public interest reports, but I'm not sure the auditors were as present prior to this stuff coming out. So if we move on one, Adrian. Just like when I was doing some work on the FM code, financial management code, I found CIPRA also issued 4 pillars of financial resilience, and they're all about reserves again, and revenue budgets and gaps in budgets. It's all very valid financial sustainability measures. But I think I would add to that, and particularly now, ones around capital management, capital strategies and treasury management strategies, because actually, if you look at some of the latest stuff, it's around management of capital and of borrowing and of treasury generally that have become real sort of points of potential failure. So interesting that the four pillars exclude capital. If we move on one, I've probably shown this before. If you click on a couple of slides, actually, as you can see, they just build up. For me, the balance sheet is where everything goes on. You got your reserves. We run a reserves model, and that comes out what I call the current account. Your reserves backed by cash, working capital, etc. general fund reserve, EMI reserves, etc. But then you've got an interplay. Some of that working capital is used for internal borrowing, which is part of the capital financing requirements, alongside long-term and short-term borrowing. And actually, all that makes up your capital finance requirement, i.e. you need to borrow, and that there's a relationship between you need to borrow and the value of your asset, not dissimilar to a mortgage. And with the CFR effectively the mortgage outstanding, your capital adjustment account revaluation reserve your equity. And then the pension kind of looks at the ability, being space and reserves on the long-term liability. So if we move on one, excuse me, just looking at CFR. So the CFR is the need to borrow, and that's how it's changed over the last 6 years. Lots more borrowing in districts, lots more in London and in unity. And that correlates quite well with the Section 114 authorities, in that they all come from those groups where borrowing has gone up, with the exception in London. Excuse me, I've got a bit of problem in my throat. You move on one, Adrian. And that shows the same data, but for all upper tier authorities. You can see there are lots of unitaries that have weighed into commercial investments, ostensibly on the left there, where the CFRs have gone up. Some of those are now in the list of potential 114s. Move on another one, and it should be the districts. Again, on the left there, this is the increase in debt gearing, i.e. CFR as a percentage of capital assets. Lots of districts that have made significant commercial investments have moved up to have large needs to borrow and large increases in that need to borrow. And again, those on the left there are all now subjected to the government's intervention and investigation of borrowing, which is finding its way into the news a fair bit. But if we're going to go next on to some of the specific authorities that have been mentioned. Pardon me, I'm going to start with Southampton. A report came out in 151 a couple of weeks ago saying major risk of Section 114. I looked at their capital health, their gearing is low and it's diminishing. So there's definitely not a capital health thing there. But actually, if I look at reserves, this model shows upper tier reserves as a proportion of net revenue expenditure from the 21-22 accounts, and below it, the change in the 1 year. And Southampton is picked about a third from the left there. And they have had the largest reduction in usable reserves, which points to the fact that they might have a bit of a structural deficit in their budget. And actually, I think I went on to have a look at that, look at their site, look at their Section 25 report. And they've done a really, really good job of their Section 25 report, very responsible, which the Director of Finance said that we've used reserves quite significantly in the last year, and we plan to do so over the next couple of years. And we can't keep doing this. We have to start finding those savings. I think the further an excitement around the subject of 114 has then elevated that into as a news story. But in actual fact, I think what I see there are quite robust processes, albeit with a budget gap that probably had been blown up. That's more than they would have a few years ago because of all of the excitement about the subject. But actually, not a big capital health problem. Yes, there is a revenue budget problem, but from reading their reports, it seems kind of like they're on top of it. So I don't think there's anything particularly worrying at Southampton any more than there is at other authorities that have structural deficits. I think the fact that Southampton made a good job of their Section 25 adequacy of reserves is a real plus point for them. And one of the learnings I would say is that these sort of processes need to be done better. They need not to be last year's report just rehashed with a few changes in figures and change in year, but something that's a bit more thorough. Southampton were thorough with theirs. So if we move on then what you see there is that, this is a analysis of CFR and usable reserves effectively on the same graph, different axes. So you do see that dip in reserves, which is the green line more recently. That's quite a big dip, given that reserves tend to have gone up in the upper tier. But actually, you see quite a settled capital financing requirement, one that looks like it's under control with debt being pared down. So the lessons for me, we should be doing these analyses to look at them over time, comparing them with others. And actually, the Section 25 report, as at Southampton, is a really, really important part of the financial resilience process now. So let's move on to some of our favourites. Croydon and Slough. I won't dwell on this if you move on, because you'll all know that Croydon and Slough are routinely in the news. The same analysis there shows them to be similar for fairly different reasons, for different reasons, but all coming back to governance and capability and capacity around finance, lack of business cases, problems with external companies, etc. But actually, if you look at the balance sheet, both of them had diminishing reserves from about 3, 4, 5 years ago, and also an increase in capital financing requirements. So weighing more into debt, but without necessarily the provision to be able to repay that because reserves were dwindling. Hence, they both issued 114. So if we move on beyond that, the Croydon Public Interest Report, talks about structural gap associated with social care pressures and the need to sort that out. It actually says the Section 25 report was inadequate and there wasn't sufficient challenge. It wasn't a particularly good report in the first place, and that members and officers need to get more realistic at tracking savings targets, but also talks to some of the poor decisions around commercial property investment and the brick by brick company, and adequacy of treasury management and brick by brick being an external company. So that was Croydon. And move on to Slough from their external insurance review. Lots of similar things, but more around the capacity and capability of the organisation not to realise that it was in so much trouble with respect to capital. A lot about the adequacy of treasury management, but also of the capacity within the team and the leadership of that team over the years, and the lack of member awareness and challenge to that, and therefore the weakness in annual processes, annual governance processes, etc. And that, if we move on one. This now is the AGS, from what looks like a really, really sound authority, good medium-term financial strategy, lots of scrutiny, lots of committees to scrutinise, constructive challenge and move on again. It talks about capital strategy, corporate treasury management, all looks really, really, really good. A sound authority, clearly. And if we move on one, it just happens to be Thurrock, unfortunately, and in spite of an AGS which makes no mention of some of the problems that later were unveiled, Thurrock is now in Section 1. Well, it has declared 114. And if we move on, just to look at the auditors, well, look at the accounts first. The 817 million, which is the part of or a third of which has been written off already, with others further write-offs potentially in the offing, just warrants one line in the accounts, and it's a fairly bland line and a fairly vague line. That sort of getting close to £1 billion worth of investment should probably have a little bit more than one line, and therefore one might expect an auditor to maybe have raised that before as part of the accounts, but actually in the same year that one line was put in, the auditors gave it a true and fair review of the financial position of the council, which turned out not to be true, and a good use of resources assessment to boot. So if we move on one, I think given that the AGS had very little forewarning, given that the auditors gave it a clean bill of health not long before the problems came to light, there's clearly something missing in existing processes. And Redmond has already concluded that the external audit mechanism as it currently is not sufficient to deliver full assurance, particularly in respect of financial sustainability and value for money, and there were clearly failures of governance, scrutiny, due diligence, business cases, etc., not dissimilar to Croydon. If we move on again. So what can we learn from these? I think there's some big learning here. I think there's a need for us to move away from tick box mentality. How many of us have done an annual governance statement, just taken last year's and looked around the edges? How many times do we just use Section 25 report as an append to the budget, which was quite gruesome, and therefore it's just something that we again might have taken from previous years. So I think there's a lot around tick box mentality there. I think the annual governance, the Sit for Solace code, and now the new FM code needs to be a bit clearer about doing that, and more substantive, not just ticking and saying we complied with this, but actually looking at what the figures show us. As I always say, I think that we should look at the balance sheet, not just as a thing which balances, but we should look at what it's telling us. We should compare it with others. We should compare it over time. We should benchmark much more. And then obviously in the big decisions we make, we should have options appraisal, due diligence and sensitivity analysis. But if we move on, move on again. So I'm talking now about the newer crop, and I don't think they are like Slough or Thurrock, or I think and Croydon. I think there's a distinction here. There was a recent Sky News report, Spelthorne and Runnymede, which is quite amusing in that it said that they spend more on interest on their loans than they do on providing services like transport, social care. Both Runnymede and Spelthorne are districts and therefore not highways or social care authorities, but that I guess shows the quality of the coverage on this. In that actually in the first paragraph they're already mixed up, and they go on to mix up a few things, but nonetheless Spelthorne and Runnymede have got very huge debt portfolios, very huge commercial property portfolios, and have come under the spotlight. Similarly, Woking Borough Council, a bit hard to see because I haven't issued accounts this year. And also my favourite one from the Warrington Guardian is Warrington about to be on the naughty step over finances, and it looks like it is about to be on the naughty step, because all of these have been touted as DLUC crack SITFA GT crack squads going in on behalf of DLUC to have a look at their high borrowing. So if we have a look a little bit at these authorities, same sort of analysis I've showed for Slough and Woking, and the green line there shows usable revenue reserves. In all cases, they've gone up significantly over the last few years, and they've gone up primarily because of the returns from their commercial properties. So they're not like Slough or Thurrock or Croydon, where reserves are chronically low and have given rise to a 114. They're quite different. In actual fact, Spelthorne has the highest level of reserves of all districts, and Runnymede the third highest. They've also got the highest debt levels as well, as the red line shows. So yes, they've got increasing debt, but they're not quite on their knees yet. But I guess with economic conditions as they are, they're more susceptible to issues surrounding their debt, and more susceptible to sensitivities around income from property, from debt costs going up, etc., etc. So probably rightly so are being looked at. But I take the view that I'd be slightly worried by the way DLUC are, the way they're picking out these authorities, because actually it's not as simple as borrowing levels. There's lots of other parts to that equation, like the assets, like the delivery of returns against the assets, like the debt profile, etc., etc. It's far more nuanced than just high levels of debt. So I worry that some of the authorities that have been looked at probably don't necessarily need to be looked at, and I worry that the authorities that probably do need to be looked at that aren't being picked up by those fairly crude criteria. But if we move on, Adrian, please. So yeah, all of these healthy and improving usable reserves, but high debts nonetheless. So I think we need to look at more than just debt gearing and reserves. We need to go more closely into that, and started doing a little bit of work on that. And lots of these authorities have and will have claimed that they have done due diligence, and that they're happy with their debt profile. They're happy with the risk that they took in taking out these commercial property investments. And one would hope that the reviews look at that in quite some detail, and not just the blunt figures that come out of here. But if we move on, some of the things that I think we need to look at, not just CFR, but actually now we need to look at debt financing costs with interest rates going up. We need to look at short-term, the divide between short and long-term borrowing, because short-term borrowing now might be hard to switch into lower rates given interest rate rises. Similarly, internal and external borrowing, I think there's lots of cash swirling around with COVID, but that's reducing. So if authorities have to externalise that borrowing, are they doing so at rates that are much, much higher than the 0% that they're paying on their own resources, they're paying 4 to 5%. So there's a lot more nuance in capital now that we've really got to get hold of with our treasury management strategies and our capital strategies. So if we move on one, this is only a little bit of work I did last night trying to work this out. And this is the sort of thing, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's the right sort of thing to look at, but it's the sort of thing we should start looking at. So I looked at the relationship between usable revenue reserves and the CFR. And therefore, if the CFR gives you the proxy for, say, income reduced by 5% on the properties that are underpinned by the CFR, or if interest rates went up, debt finance costs went up by X%, how susceptible would the authority be? Because the CFR being a proxy for those sensitivities in terms of the URR, and immediately what you see is that the Thurrock, the Croydons, the Sloughs have got really, really low levels of resilience when compared to their CFR. Their URR as reserves as a proportion of CFR is tiny. The other authorities that have been looked at have a much, not a great resilience, because we're only talking 6-7%, but significantly more and improving. And then again, that kind of indicates that actually that some of those authorities are wary of the risks and are putting aside reserves to be able to manage and mitigate those risks. So I think it's only the start of some work, but it's the sort of work we should be doing. And we can do that by looking at our balance sheets, and we can do that by looking at our debt profiles. I still think that if we move on one, I think the Prudential Code is absolutely right in terms of its three main measures: prudence, affordability, sustainability. I still worry about whether the indicators are actually getting to the detail of this and being able to wheedle out some of the issues that a really close look at the balance sheet, a comparative look over time and with others would do. So I think for me, it's an area of improvement. We spend loads of time on our revenue budget, on our council tax setting. Often the capital programme is nodded through. Capital finance requirement is what we put together based on what we need to be able to borrow without very much more context. So I think there's work to be done in that area generally, not everywhere, because some people do it really well. I think the CITFA FM code is absolutely right, but it's so massive. There are 17 standards, 6 principles, 7 areas of focus, 4 pillars of it all needs to be organised a little bit so that actually, if we were doing proper reviews of that, not just tick box reviews, we'd be able to get to the heart of it. And processes like Section 25 reports need to be elevated and need to be done well. And I think there just has to be a much greater emphasis on financial resilience. We need to have an MTFS, which is a proper strategy. It's not just a budget gap picture with very vague plans as how to that big breach. We need to spend more time. We need to learn to love our balance sheets, look at revenue and capital health over time, compare with others. And obviously, we need to make sure that material decisions are supported by options appraisal, good business case, sensitivity analyses to all the things that can go wrong and are going wrong with economic conditions these days. And obviously, we need to share all of that with members. And that's me done. So I'm 1 minute over, Adrian.
That's pretty good, Dan. That's great. Thanks very much for that. Great. It feels like two different ends of the spectrum, the two presentations. One kind of looking ahead, kind of generally, and yours kind of like picking up where we are at this point in time with lots more specifics. That's great, Dan. And pretty much bang on. I think we'll take that as being on time. Before we start looking through questions in the chat and everything, is there anything anyone wants to kind of step forward and say? Any comments, any thoughts at this point? Might be easy just to look at some of the questions as they come up, but yeah.
Sorry, Shabana. I had missed Nottingham off. I've also missed off Northumberland, not Middlesbrough, but Middlesbrough are often quoted. Nottingham's a really interesting one in that we've talked about this, Adrian. It's made some poor decisions around Robin Hood Energy, but actually, if you look at its capital health, it's pretty healthy, and I think it's because it's always had a really large portfolio of properties that it's had since 1974, and its reserves similarly are in good fettle. Now, there's some authorities where Section 114s have had to be issued because of more legality reasons. It's an interesting one, Nottingham, because I don't see it unless when their accounts come out for 21, 22, there's a massive downward turn. It is, if it's under financial stress, and there are 100 other upper tier authorities that are under financial stress as well, because it does really, it's got a high level of reserves and increasing and decentish capital health. But
Yeah, I know what you mean, Dan. It's like two different types of financial stress, isn't it? It's not just about yeah. I think just gonna just maybe
is that background?
yeah. Though I don't know. I might have muted you by mistake. If that's all right. You had to put yourself back on again. Yeah, I mean, if we kind of move on and have a look at some of the questions that have come up, I think Mark Nicholson, Newcastle, you're asking about when the next spending review is due to be published. I know I said it in the slide. I think it's. I mean, I'm saying it's going to be autumn 24, but I mean, if there's an election in autumn 24, it's not going to be then. I don't know what that would be. Whether it would just be a very rapid autumn statement after that that just got the numbers in place. I'm not sure, but I mean, I'm assuming it's going to be autumn 24. I mean, if anyone's heard anything different or thinks something different, it'd be worth mentioning it, because that's what I'm working on. But after the last year or so, we really are used to things. Anything could happen at any time. Martin Hunter at Wakefield, you were saying about surprised how we're talking about 100% business rate retention. Thought there was no appetite for further rate retention. I know what you're saying. I was a little bit surprised yesterday that they were talking again about 100% retention. I kind of thought that was off the cards and people were moving away from it. But yeah, that seems to be the thing. I'm not surprised. I think it's a great idea. I think I would definitely try and move towards 100% retention, even if you haven't got much business rate growth. Keeping as much of it as possible, in most cases, is a good thing. Obviously, if you're below baseline or you've got some of those risks around appeals, it's not such a great idea. But I'd go for it, and I'm guessing that's what the trailblazer areas have asked for as well. And I'm sure if Martin Mitchell's on the call from GLA, I'm sure Martin, in London, you go for 100% retention, would you?
Actually, perhaps we just need to be nicer to the government compared to some other mayors. I don't know, but maybe that will change in a couple of years' time. But obviously, it's something we're keen to see roll forward. Because one thing that was also picked up in those trailblazer deals is that the potential to have lots of small local enterprise zones, designated areas, keeping business rates growth for a 25-year period that could be negotiated, which obviously would help to fund infrastructure, regeneration, transport projects potentially. So that's another sub-benefit. So it's not just the 10 years for the wider business rates growth. Potentially there could be 25-year deals around, local enterprise zones, Freeport's designated areas as well as part of that, which is probably even more beneficial if you could actually focus growth on those growth areas and therefore keep it for even longer periods. So
yeah, I know what you mean, Mike. So basically, a 10-year baseline is great, but a 25-year baseline is even better, isn't it? In that sense, yeah.
Especially as you keep revaluation growth and there's no levies or anything like that. So
yeah. Shabana, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I mean, all of this is based on the business rate system as is, but there was no announcements or review of the changing sort of landscape of what high streets are and what business rates would in future pay for, where businesses will be sitting. And that is fundamental, linked to both from a local government funding reforms, but also how these new MCAs or area, combined authority funding and these investment zones are going to look to work. It's like a chicken and egg. That's great, but not having an understanding and policy or strategy of what does it mean from a longer perspective, because there's quite a lot of high streets with empty buildings.
Yeah.
And there's a housing need, and there was very little on housing support or housing development to kind of push that through as well. So
I know what you're saying. So it's almost like the government, and I guess the Labour opposition as well. They've both said that there's lots wrong with business rates. We want to change them. Do we want to move to a land tax rather than business premises tax, all that kind of thing? they're both clearly unhappy with business rates, and yet it's kind of like a linchpin of the Devo deals and funding local government, isn't it? It doesn't quite make sense. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
It's interesting, actually, because I've just been. I'm at a Society of District Council Treasurers event, and the women representative there said that, with the exception of things like Trailblazers and things that we've seen in the budget and that been announced recently, that's now their focus because they're anticipating the election themselves.
Yeah.
There's likely to be, like we all know now, there's going to be no fair funding change or reset, etc. short of that. But they also said that they're clearly now in a period where they start talking to the opposition, i.e. Labour, as to what their views are. And I don't think as yet there's any indication it's a clear view from the opposition as there is from the government of what might happen. So I think we will be in a bit of a stasis for a couple of years, other than the things that have already been announced.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that does seem to have that kind of cross-party support is the idea about devolution. I've not read it, but I mean, I've read about the Gordon Brown kind of like devolution kind of constitutional settlement that Labour are talking about, and I don't know whether this government's just trying to get a bit ahead of some of that and get some of its ideas in place first before the general election. I'm not sure. But that does seem to be one place where things are moving, and I suspect things will move before the general election as well. Well, one last point for you, Martin, with GLA. I think your problem is you haven't got a mayor called Andy. That's what you need. That seems to way the successful mayors.
But obviously, at least we can fund free school meals for primary school children, unlike those Andys at the moment. So there are some benefits coming from our pilot. So
that's true.
There's quite a few remarks on the audits as well. Holly makes the point about the audit delays.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
The fact that it's that sends everything further back, and it is a shocker because I've just done some work on that. 20 out of 164 district accounts have been signed off, and I think it's 12 or 14 out of 149. No, it's 12 out of 149 of tier authorities have had their 21-22 accounts finalised. Some 6 months after the deadlines, and we're all hurtling towards the 22-23 accounts, aren't we? And there's still more unpublished 21-22 accounts than there are audited accounts. So and external auditors who are obsessed with PPE valuations, which I think is also Jonathan puts into the chat as well, and pension valuations that are, let's face it, just a little bit meaningless in terms of financial health, aren't they?
I guess because of those things, it just allows people not to be quite as focused on some stuff you were talking about, I suppose.
Yeah.
There was another point that Tony Watts at Islington made about given the variability of forecasts, what views have people got about where to prudently pitch the September CPI figure this year. I agree. I think it's really hard to work that one out. I think in the model at the moment I've got 7.4% just because that was the average CPI forecast for 2023. But I'm pretty sure it's going to be less than that. I think for what it's worth, somewhere between about 3.5% and about 6.5%, something like that. But that's quite a big range. I guess you pitch it towards the bottom end. I think when we redo our model in the next month or so, I think we'll probably pitch it at about 4.5% CPI, just as kind of like a central forecast for planning purposes. But it is, given that it's going to be pegged to that September figure, it's worth just moving it around a bit, looking at what that does to your level of funding, because it will shift it a bit. As we said in the slide, from the top to the bottom, that range that's worth about 500 million quid. So it's not nothing, but it's worth looking at different ranges, I think. Yeah. So any other points coming through, Dan? I think I missed there. I think
most of them. Shout up, guys, if we've missed anything.
Yeah. I think it was, in some ways, from my point of view, from the budget, Dan, it was a fairly it was a calmer budget. It was a calmer fiscal statement than we've been used to in a long time. So, in some respects, there were no fireworks. There were no kind of like big announcements or things you weren't expecting. It's just fine tuning of some of those forecasts. I think that the big thing that was unexpected was the big devolution announcement. I thought that was quite on the Trailblazers. That was quite a biggish thing, and that the reignition of the potential to move towards 100% business rates. The business rates is still the thing that they're thinking about from a local government point of view in terms of localizing revenue streams.
And it's interesting though, isn't it? Because I mean, particularly for districts, but also to a lesser degree for upper tiers, it's the business rates gains either through pilots or arrangements that have caused the biggest sort of distortion, if you like, in spending power at district levels, where some have got no growth whatsoever and some are just racing ahead because of extra airports or motorways, and then the arrangements for those pilot authorities are pretty generous as well, and there's a lot now hoping to get similar arrangements. So there's a lot to be made from business rates gain either through pilot or just through being in the right sort of area and having the economic growth around.
And doing the sorts of things that Martin talked about with enterprise zones alongside the pilots as well. There's a lot of revenue to be raised. Shabana, have you got your hand up is that a new hand or is that from before?
No, a new hand.
Yeah.
Sorry. It was just a couple of things. It kind of sort of links with your presentation as well as Dan's. Mm-hmm. It's, obviously there's been a lot of, I would say, one-off last-minute funding announcements, in support for cost of living, whether that's the additional support through council tax, as well as the housing support fund to kind of continue. And I just feel like that kind of mask or hides the true impact for local authorities to kind of not really see that through, what that means locally in terms of, cost pressure. So as what I mean is as those funds kind of disappear, over a short period, it could be between 6 to 18 months after those have disappeared, council will start seeing the actual impact of them through increased pressures because of the support, and that will very much depend on where the economy is and also what the markets are really kind of doing. But that, those risks when you're trying to manage that, and also when you're setting whether that's a financial strategy to assess the risks and kind of give the Section 2.5 around resilience, it's so difficult because there's a lot of one-off funds that have been since the COVID period that have been masking the true financial resilience of councils. For some, where they've had reserves to kind of manage those or other ways of funding it. But as those things disappear, I just feel like there's a lot more authorities that are probably not really realizing their potential impact, or that potential impact isn't that evident or can be translated in a way that can be seen by government to see that there are underlying pressures.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think it's interesting because I've just been talking in another forum about the government saying that reserves were baffling and they're trying not to be headbangers over it, is what they were quoted as, but they need to understand it better. And that's absolutely right, because I think reserves have gone up significantly over the last 2 years, but it's exactly those sort of pots that you talked about, Shabana, as well as the sort of timing differences with business rates reliefs have really sort of obscured the picture. And actually, I've not met anyone yet who thinks our reserves in 22-23 are going to do anything other than plummet. Because of those things starting to move aside. So it's I think it'll be a really interesting picture. And though I agree with the government, I think they should have a better handle on reserves. I'm not sure that handle will be got from RA forms, I should say. I know we'll be looking at the reserves as soon as the accounts are out at the end of May and to start to see what they are. But I suspect they will drop significantly for the very reasons that you've just set out there.
I guess you're saying as well, Shimano, that there are things like the support programs that are in place for individuals and businesses as they start to, some of the reliefs, the business rate reliefs, etc., the household support funds, that kind of thing, as those sorts of supports get whittled away, as they inevitably will do, as we get further away from the pandemic and further away from the cost of living crisis, that puts pressure on your local, your people, your residents, your businesses, and I guess in the really sort of narrow sense, that gives a bit more risk on things like council tax revenues, business rate revenues, all that kind of thing. But also more widely, I guess, you mean as well the kind of pressures that you've got to support as an authority. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking as well? That actually,
it is that. It's almost like you've got different things. If you shift that away, if the money isn't there for those residents or businesses, they'll come knocking the door either because they're not paying it and you're not getting the income. So you'll have a pressure inevitably through a financial means, but you'll also have more of those people either for somehow coming to needing more support. Through either council tax reduction schemes or support schemes, as most other councils call it, or from housing or more homelessness cases. It really would kind of increase that demand and that pressure that is not necessarily thought through because of these one-off fundings that have gone on beyond 1 year now. So they've almost become norm for some of these families to balance their finances, you see. So the risk becomes that they are using that to stay steady. And as that kind of is taken away, they're immediately going to have pressures.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm surprised that some of those schemes have carried on as long as they have, especially things like the Household Support Fund. I mean, to some degree, I'm not quite sure that the government's has received the plaudits that it probably ought to have done for keeping them going. They just seem to have become part of the furniture and carried on. I'm surprised they have kept going as long as they have in some respects, but that doesn't help any, does it?
No, and I suppose the only other thing I was going to say was with the business rates revaluations kind of kicking in or being implemented from this year. So a lot of councils have had a change in terms of, between top up and what they're going to kind of collect. So we're one council that had a very large decrease in terms of our top up grant and more in terms of retained or say locally collected. That kind of shifts the risk that the local authority will have, that we'll need to manage, and we won't know what that risk is over time, and the increases aren't small. We're one of the largest, on average is like 22% of an increase for us. So it's knowing what that will kind of convey by the time you get to the outturn, and what that will convey into a settlement would mean our collection rates might plummet, or we'll have more to set aside from a debt recovery perspective. What I'm saying is there's a shift in that risk that revaluations have inadvertently brought for some councils such as ours.
Yeah, and the idea that revaluation was fiscally neutral is only really at the point of the revaluation. As you say, it doesn't take into account that you may have more risk or less risk in the future. One or two authorities shifted from being top-up authorities to tariff authorities and started paying a levy, and they were out of pocket as a result. Peter Spence, I think did you put your hand up, Peter?
I did, yes. Thanks, Adrian. And just on that point of valuation, we were the opposite. So we had about a 15% increase in our total RV. The current list to the new one. So that we were one of the authorities that went from a top up. So our top up this year is about 2.6 million, and we flipped next year to a tariff of about 700k. So quite a big shift there. However, what we've realised, just looking back at the update lists on the VOA website, the 2023 update lists, is that in the last few weeks we've seen a hit of about 8 million lost from our RV. And this is since we set the NNDR1 and since we set the budget. So it's a bit of a nightmare, really. And it's largely related to industrial sort of warehouse, workshop, that kind of category. I spoke to the VOA about it yesterday. And it has been an issue elsewhere in the Southwest, but she confirmed elsewhere in the country as well. So my first point is, if you haven't been keeping an eye on those 2023 update lists, do, because it could have a big impact. So I guess part of my question to you is, I assume that overall the national quantum of rateable value has fallen. There may have been areas that have gone up, but what does that mean? What does that mean for the sort of true up, any potential true up position in future years for the, even the multiplier and so on? But specifically for us, if I look at our total RV now, which is 181 million compared to 189 million when we did the NNDR1, we wouldn't actually be a tariff authority at all. We'd be a top-up authority.
Yeah.
And we're pretty sure that will get trued up in a future year, but it'd be good if that you could confirm.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it will get trued up, Peter. As you say, I think that, they're going to be looking again at what's the actual rating list on the 1st of April. And I guess the key thing is that does actually, I think Martin's just said that point, the full rating list as it is on the 1st of April will then feed through into adjusted tariffs and top-ups. And for you, it should mean that does get adjusted, and that the real effect on you in 23-24 is that you remain a top-up authority and not a tariff authority. But as Martin said, there could be some cash flow issues that, you go through the year as though you're a tariff with that £8 million worth of extra RV, and then year end things get adjusted, and you don't get recompense for that until the year after. That could be the issue for you, I think, Peter. But the idea is that certainly on the local level that should be trued up.
Yeah, I think we can live with the cash flow thing. I haven't run it through your model, and we were pretty sure that it would be trued up. But yeah, it's certainly a budgetary kind of pain that we can do without. So
that's very.
That's anybody else to check those 20
worth having a look.
If you're not doing that.
Yeah. And on the national level, I'm not sure, Peter. I'm not sure whether the VOA go through and true up their estimates. I think they're probably done though. I think they've made their estimate. They've set the multiplier. They've set the assessment, the allowance for appeals within that, and that's done now. And my guess is that at the national level, there are things that are happening coming in and out of the rating list, but actually nationally it doesn't make much difference. But I think they're probably done. I think they probably they've set the multiplier. They've done that, and that's it now. But I will check that. I will check that with Jeffrey Whitby at DLUC and see, just to make sure. I did ask as well, although it doesn't affect you anymore. I did ask whether an authority that moves from a top up to a tariff position as a result of revaluation shouldn't have to pay a levy. But given that you're one of the two, and that doesn't affect you now, and the only one that's left is Northamptonshire, but they definitely said no, they're not doing that. So I did try. How are we doing for time, Dan? 25 minutes past. Anything that we haven't dealt with in the chat, Dan? Any other questions that are coming through that we should have a look at before we sign off?
Martin's put lots of useful clarifications in there, but unless anybody thinks we've missed anything, I think we're almost there.
Yeah, I think
Last
so.
chance, anybody?
Yeah. Okay. I think that might be us, Dan. The slides will be on the website pretty much imminently. I'll try and do the recording as fast as I can. It just takes me a while to process the thing, and then I'll put it on our website. Dan will put it on his as well, and you can look at it there. And yeah, other than that, thanks very much for coming along and contributing and showing interest. Thanks very much, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, Dan. Thanks.
Cheers.
See you.
Bye.
Bye now.